We live in an age where simplicity seems to be a virtue. No matter where we go, no matter what we do, we are told to keep it simple, stupid. Supposedly because being simple and the act of simplifying are keys to getting things done. Simplification is how we become efficient. It is how we stay efficient. And indeed, when the simple works, it's great. But the simple is not the only characteristic of the world in which we live. Much of our world depends on interactions with other people, with things, with environment, in general, with context, and interactions are seldom simple. So, what do you do when being simple, when the act of simplifying is just not good enough, when simplicity fails? I call the answer Remedy 101. Our paths to success are seldom simple. They're often highly nuanced and very complicated. But we all know it's a whole lot easier to go around a maze than to attempt to go through it. In fact, there is a relationship between simplicity and effectiveness. The more simple we seem to be, the more simple our message gets across, the more effective we seem to be. Indeed, Staples even calls this the easy button. The truth is, we can't survive if we only deal with the parts of the world that are simple. We need to deal with the not simple portions too. And then, to confound things even more, sometimes what we think is simple is only simple because we personally simplified it. It may be better understood as being complicated or complex or ambiguous. What that means is that our very act of simplifying has let us down. And then again, sometimes what we individually see as simple or as obvious, others see as something else. Perhaps they see a different simple, or perhaps they see a reality which is more complicated than the one that we are choosing to address. In addition, there's this little problem known as ambiguity. Ambiguity is when there are multiple meanings for the same thing. Ambiguity challenges our notion of the simple. There are many kinds of ambiguity. We can't all seem to sit on the same kind of seat on an airplane. Caitlyn Jenner once asked why there were no urinals in the ladies' room. And then Wall Street had these things known as AAA ratings, which once upon a time actually meant something. And then, well, they didn't. It seems that ambiguity gets in our way. When there are multiple meanings, ambiguity fights with simplicity. And when it does this, instead of helping, ambiguity hurts. Ambiguity is a fight against simplicity. But ambiguity is not the only thing that fights simplicity. So too is disagreement. Let's take an example I'm sure almost all of us are well familiar with, the problem of climate change or global warming. When you see a graph about what has happened with temperatures, this is the graph that you usually see. Please pay attention to the red line sloping upward toward the right. When scientists talk about the ever-present trend of global warming, it is this red line that they are talking about. And it clearly shows a pattern that we all need to deal with. But, and there is a but, same graph, same data, but a different interpretation. Look at the blue lines. What they show is periods where global warming seems to have taken a rest. These periods seem to be somewhat stable. The message of the blue line can be seen to be conflicting with the message of the red line. It's actually the same data. It's the same graph. It shows the same overall trend, but it reveals a very different interpretation. What the climate change graphs illustrate is that if you are going to have a simplicity effectiveness relationship, it actually maps into dependence on two other variables. You need to have agreement among all the people that are looking, and they need to believe that what they're looking at is appropriate. The graph becomes one of, is there asserted conformity to some desired position or similarity along the bottom, and then acceptability, which is the willingness to engage in actual meaningful dialogue. Without agreement and without appropriateness, it just doesn't work, and the simplicity effectiveness relationship may not hold. Now, one kind of agreement has to do with other people. If they don't see what you see, if they don't speak about what you're speaking about, that disagreement gets in the way of simplifications, and it may cause ambiguity. The other kind of agreement has to do with whether or not your model is appropriate for the situation. Context matters. Appropriateness matters. And it is appropriateness that will be the focus of this talk. When ambiguity and disagreement are present, the graph that you see displays a chasm. What happens is that as similarity increases, so too does acceptability. People are happy to talk to one another when they generally think things are similar. But the surprise is what happens somewhere around the 70% mark on this graph. Everything suddenly falls off the cliff. Now, people that have one belief are unwilling to talk to people that have a different interpretation about the same data. We call this the chasm of dissonance. And the chasm of dissonance is your biggest problem in dealing with ambiguity and with dealing with when simplification fails. When confronted with that chasm, when confronted with the idea that our simplification efforts have failed, what we do is we have to find a way to cope. Coping is what gets us through. It's not that we need to know the right answer. It's that we need to know how to cope. We cope by creating our own simplicity. What we do is create our own reality. We make observations out in the world, and then we filter those observations by telling stories. The stories that we tell are how we go about making sense of what we observe. And much of the time, the stories that we tell, whether to us, ourselves, or to others, are simple stories. They tend to take the form that the world is X or the world is Y. What we do is we filter reality, or at least the reality that we're observing, almost without thought. First, we limit our field of attention. We try to narrow the context of what we're dealing with. Then, we limit the factors to be considered. We assert the idea of boundaries and constraints. We are narrowing the reality so that we can make it simple. Then we try to predict likely outcomes given the boundaries and constraints that we have asserted. In doing this, we're now creating a reality because the predictions are predictions from inside us, our models, our heads, our beliefs. Then we choose amongst our predictions. We had a set of many, and we've picked one, or maybe two. And in doing so, what we've done is we have created our own simple construct. Now, when you look around, those simple constructs are everywhere. They're in the Nike slogan, just do it. They're in Staples' easy button. They're in the idea of a drive-through window or take-out food. They're in Apple's slogan, it just works. These are simple constructs, and the simple constructs are there in an effort to help you try to find certainty. Because if you've got certainty, then you have a way of basing actions. But you've got to remember, the simplicity is your own head's creation. And sometimes Well, sometimes certainty can be rather quite elusive. Both smoking and jumping are certainly possible interpretations. Let's try a different example. Do you see the peasant woman? Do you see the man? Do you see both? Do you see what your neighbor sees? How do you know? The slide is very ambiguous, and that ambiguity gets in the way of simplification. It might get in the way of action. The simple lesson here is that context matters. The very thing that makes that slice of pizza very nice when sitting on a plate in the restaurant on the left doesn't work to keep it so nice when it's sitting on the sewer grate in the street on the right. We need to simplify. We need to find a way of coping. And to do this, we use what are known as black boxes. Now, black boxes are a way of simplifying. It's a way of taking some input X, relating it to some output Y, and being able to ignore the mechanics of what goes on in between X and Y. We use black boxes to simplify and to agree. Inside the black box is some unknown and unexamined process. What we observe is the input and the output. We ignore the mechanism inside so as to simplify our reality. Our goal is to make the complex appear to be simple. Black boxes are our constructed as-ifs. They are the building blocks of our stories. We use them to tell stories. We use them as the characters in our stories, but they are our own constructions. When they're used appropriately, black boxes help to package ambiguity and complexity into simplicity. But when used inappropriately, this encourages us to overlook context and the kinds of dependencies on situation, other people, resources, beliefs, history, etc. We overlook those things in favor of a powerful model or a powerful label. When the model or label is correct, all is well. But if the model or label is wrong, one can drown in the resulting ambiguity and its dissonance. Or worse, you can freeze like a deer in the headlights due to uncertainty. A key concept here, then, is the word appropriately. So what does appropriately mean? The first thing about appropriately is to know whether you have a model or merely a description. A model means that you have given the listener an opportunity for action in your narrative. Descriptions do not provide that kind of opportunity. Are you generating resonance? This tells you whether your black box matches both the context and the understanding of the listeners. Together, knowing that you have a model, which allows for action, and that you have resonance, will determine that your narrative about any given black box actually fits the context in which you wish to apply it. And that fit is what we mean by appropriateness. Let's take an example. Most of us are well aware of the London subway system. This is its normal map. The map is great if you are using the map to negotiate how to get around on the underground. It is a really bad, useless map if you're trying to figure out how to get around on the surface. The map is appropriate to its function, the use of the subway. It is inappropriate to something that is not its function, which is walking around on the streets. Take another example. In the London subway system, you can find copies of this chart. Now, what it purports to tell you is what you need to do in a given subway station if you would like to recreate the condition of climbing to the summit of a mountain. It's ridiculous. It's merely a set of descriptions. Obviously, there are major differences between trying to climb the summit of a rugged mountain and trying to take the stairs in a subway station. Stairs that might be locked, stairs that have foul, dank-smelling air. Those are very different from rugged terrain and a lack of oxygen. This chart is nothing but a description. It doesn't give you or the listener or the observer any opportunity for real action. So, there are some questions that you can ask in order to find appropriateness. The first is to ask if you are presenting a model, something that you can act on, or are you merely offering up a description? How do you distinguish a model from a description? There is something that is known as the modeling relationship, which is shown here, that actually tells you how to do it. You need to have all four of the things shown in this chart to be present. But let's go through the parts that are important so that you have an easy way of distinguishing. First, in the system that you are trying to describe, is there a notion of causality? Do actions have consequences? Is there something you can actually manipulate? Second, in the representation of that system, what's called the formal system on this chart, is there a way of running experiments, be they in your mind, on a computer, or on paper? Can you draw inferences about what happens in the system from running those experiments? And then we get to the critical step. Is there a way to decode the inferences that you draw from running the experiments into actual actions in the system? If you could take and run an experiment mentally or on a simulation or on paper and decode it back into real action, you have a model. If you can't, you have a description. Once you know whether you have a model or a description, you need to ask if your story encompasses enough context so that you can address the situation at hand. And then finally, you have to decide or learn whether your story is open or closed to the current context of the listeners, not your context, not their context yesterday, but the current context of the listeners. Take the London subway map. If the context is getting around in the underground on the subway, that context says this is a great map. Take that same map, go out on the street, it's not going to really help you very much. And indeed, the kind of story that you tell affects the ability of your simplifications to work. It turns out there are four kinds of narrative. There's the anecdote, the metaphor, the abstraction, and the archetype. They matter because what kind of story we tell affects how well it's received. Each of the kinds is dependent on both, and the both is very important here, the listener and the context. So let's look at that chasm of dissonance graph. What happens is that metaphors have less similarity than abstract concepts, but both, in general, trigger high degrees of acceptability. If you have a very specific anecdote filled with information, that too is going to be highly acceptable and highly similar because there's no room for the audience. But notice the type in blue, the archetype. This is when we tell a story, a narrative, where we're saying this is an exemplar, this is an example of a category, and we use the story and the deviance from the story to determine whether or not something fits in the category. The problem with this is that we each bring different background information and a different set of beliefs to to that story. We don't all come from the same place. And thus, what you see as a great story about belief X, I might see as a ridiculous story about belief Y. When this happens, we are right in the chasm of dissonance. The narratives are about the black boxes that you tell. So the appropriateness of the black box, just like the kind of story that you tell, both matter. It turns out there are 6 kinds of black box. I'm going to go through them quickly because the details don't matter that much. But what does matter is that you are aware that there are different kinds and that they get used in different ways. So we have the rigid black box. To use McDonald's as an example, when a neighborhood zoning board thinks of a McDonald's, they don't think about all the people and the incomings and goings of what happens inside a McDonald's. They see it as some fixed thing. There are neighborhoods where that fixed thing will be viewed as a great thing. There are other neighborhoods where it'll be viewed as a very evil thing. Take the next type, malleable black box. Same McDonald's, but now we're going to put it at a highway rest stop. To the highway rest stop planner, McDonald's is very malleable. They're willing to change their hours. They're willing to change their menu. They're willing to change what the store looks like. They're willing to change lots of things in order to accomplish whatever goal it is for the highway rest stop planner. The fixed, rigid black box to the neighborhood zoning board has become a malleable black box to the highway rest stop planner. That same malleability means that there are different hooks and snaps, things that attract, in a given context, a hungry driver on a highway. If I want breakfast, well, McDonald's can give me that. If I want a bathroom, McDonald's can give me that. If I just need a cup of coffee, McDonald's can give me that. McDonald's has a different attraction, a hook or a snap, to get me in the door. To go further, we might have a permeable black box. This is a black box where, though we said you can't really see what goes on inside, this kind of black box actually has some interchangeability between the inside and the outside, some way for you to see what's going on. McDonald's took use of the black box of our interest in breakfast. Suddenly, by having breakfast available all day, we have another reason to go to McDonald's. They saw into their appeal, why it is we liked McDonald's, an Egg McMuffin, or whatever it is, and they're using it to their advantage. Next, we have a black box that sort of dissolves into something else. We might use, as an example, an explanation that we offer. When we give the explanation, the need for the label goes away. But a better example would be how a 4-year-old child reacts to a McDonald's Happy Meal. The child is thrilled. There's no separating the eating of the meal, the sharing of it with friends, the playing on the playground. It's all part and parcel of a Happy Meal to a 4-year-old. And then we get to the problem child. The problem child black box is a black box that believers see as dissolvable, much like that Happy Meal was to the 4-year-old. But non-believers see it as rigid and scary. So the Happy Meal is great unless the child's parents happen to be vegan. And then it has all kinds of other issues. Now we can illustrate this. Once again, this is a graph of the chasm of dissonance. And as before, we've mapped how the kinds of narratives fit on that graph. Now we've added the 6 kinds of black boxes. So once again, to the left, we have metaphors and abstract concepts. And they have 3 kinds of black boxes that go with them. To the right, the context-specific anecdotes are either black boxes of the rigid kind or black boxes of the dissolvable kind. Either everyone is in agreement and things just work, or there's so much specific information that things are just rigid. But please focus on the bottom of the graph, where the archetypes and the chimera-like black boxes are. Most problems are the result of stories which involve chimera-like black boxes being discussed as archetypes. It's easy to observe this with civic and political issues, such as abortion rights, or gun control, or what to do about gay marriage, or what to do about internet security. But the truth is that this kind of problem occurs in your personal life, it occurs in your business life. When you're at the bottom of that chasm of dissonance, most of the time it's because a chimera-like black box, meaning there are people who believe in it and think it's wide open, and there are other people who see it as very rigid, is being discussed in the form of an archetype. It's being discussed as a means of deciding what does and does not belong in a category. And it is that combination that causes most of the problems. What this means is that simplification and simplicity just isn't always all that simple. Every assertion of the simple, every act of simplification, they all start and evolve by making use of some black boxes that we each individually, when we do that construction, when we make use of black boxes, when we tell narratives, it is very important that we have an awareness of where we are falling on that curve which describes the chasm of dissonance. You don't want to be in the chasm itself. In the chasm, simplicity and the act of simplifying just fail. You need to be to the left or to the right. So, how do you cope? How do you move left or right when the act of simplification fails? You start by asking some questions. You ask where the failure lies. Is it in the lack of appropriateness? Is it in the kind of narrative you're telling? Is it in the kind of black box? Start by reconstructing your black box as a model. It's very important that it be a model and not a description. If you only have a description, you have no possibility of running experiments before taking action. And not only do you not have that possibility, but so too with everyone else that you're dealing with. A description has no room for experimentation and play. Only models have room for experimentation and play. So you need to determine what you need to do, change, or know to make it a model. Making it a model is critical. If you have a model, then you and everyone else can rehearse potential actions. And more importantly, given a model, you can find a simple story to tell. The second thing is to find appropriateness by examining the kind of narrative you're using and the black boxes that are the subject of that narrative. If your narrative isn't working, then one of two things is happening. Either the story you're telling is not resonating with the others you need, or the black boxes that you're using in that story are a mismatch to the situation. Either way, determine what you need to do, change, or know so that you can use black boxes which both match the situation and which will resonate with the other actors. This is the key lesson. You need a match and you need resonance. For a simple story to be effective, it must match the situation and it must resonate. This is your takeaway. You need to use models, not descriptions. Simplification works best when it involves models. It only works with descriptions in a very narrow context. So use models. The models need to match the situation at hand. They have to be appropriate. They have to generate a fit. And the models and the stories that you use have to resonate with others. If you don't have a model, if you don't have a match, if you don't have resonance, your act of simplification is likely to fail. If you do have a model and it does match and it does resonate, well, that is how we simplify. So, complex or simple? The choice is always yours. Thank you.